Welcome, everybody. We are going to be talking today about having to shift your thinking about income and expenses from the way that you were taught when you probably first got your first job and maybe the way you saw your parents do it, to a way that will help you build your golden army. And I'll explain what that's all about. Welcome, everybody. I'm JR. Welcome to the Artistry of Money. We're so happy today to be once again joined by two of my favorite people in the world, starting with Mr. Todd Vigiletti, executive producer of Stargazer Productions. Todd, would you like to say hi?
Welcome, everybody. So good to have you all back with us again. And if it's your first time, welcome for the first time.
Thanks, Todd. And of course, Ms. Karen Michaels, who is the Chief Everything Officer from Social Media Group. Karen, would you like to say hi? Sorry,
Hi,
Social Media Butterfly Group.
Social Butterfly Group.
Social Butterfly Group.
It's okay. You know what? This is interesting intel because you're not the only person who doesn't quite know the title, which means I need to do a better job of sharing that title.
I think it's just because JR just gets butterflies just when he's around you and sees you. And so he just doesn't exactly, he's like, what is it? What is it?
You're telling my secrets. You're spilling my secrets.
Okay.
So we're going to talk about what I thought I would do is share a simple story of something that I did when I acquired my commercial building. And then we can talk about the lessons that are evident in the story. I chose the story because it has a lot of lessons for us. So this starts out at a cocktail party a few years ago, let's say a decade ago, at USC, where I ran into a friend of mine from school who was working for a bank. And he told me that the bank had taken back recently a building because the owners were delinquent on their loan payments. And so they took back the building, and the bank really needed to get rid of the building. So the building was appraised at that time for about $1 million, and they were willing to sell it for $800,000. So the catch was they needed to sell it fast, within a week. They wanted to close on the building within a week, and they were not offering any financing. They wanted somebody to take this building off of their hands. So after a little bit of negotiation and after selling a couple of stocks, I ended up buying the building for $750,000. It had a tenant in it, so I was able to continue to take the rent from this tenant. And then skip forward to today, this building is now worth something over $2 million. It's probably close to about $2.25 million. And the tenant that I have in the building right now pays me $20,000 a month in rent. So I'm getting $240,000, of course, a year. And of course, out of that rent, I am paying property taxes, and I have to have insurance on the building. And of course, I'm paying income tax on all of that money. But the rest of that money just flows right into my pocket. So now let's focus on the lessons. The lesson isn't, oh my God, go buy a building if you can go buy a building. That's not the lesson. The lesson is when we first start working and we first start going out into the world and we get our first sort of adult job, I think most of us all think of the world in pretty simple terms: money coming in, which is money we're getting paid for the job that we're doing, and then expenses going out. And as we get a little older, the money coming in tends to grow, right? We get promoted to better jobs and we get more money, but then we also start spending more, right? We buy a house or a condo, and we buy, so we add a mortgage, and we buy a car, and we add a car loan. And then we obviously take on credit card debt. And that's the way most people think about money. Money coming in from the work that you do, and then money going out to pay your expenses. And you can have a really beautiful house and a beautiful car and live a beautiful life, but you're really not getting ahead until you start focusing on creating a third entity in your life. And that's what I call the golden army, right? We talked about this in previous episodes. It's really just savings, but it's savings that becomes powerful. So in my story, and Karen and Todd, please feel free to interrupt if you have any questions about this. In my story, one of the lessons is that I was only able to buy that building because I was able to pay $750,000 in cash within a week's time. If I didn't have that money, I wouldn't have bought that building. And that was a result of a lot of work. And I don't want you to get the message that I just magically had this money, because when I graduated from USC, I had nothing. My parents were generous enough, and we were fortunate enough that they were able to pay my living and my tuition and everything through USC as an undergrad. But when I graduated, so I didn't have any student loans or anything, but I had zero net worth. I started from zero when I graduated from college and started building slowly. So that's another lesson that I wanted to talk about, that magic, some people are really fortunate enough to be born to rich families and their parents can lend them $1 million. I was not in one of those families, but I was, as of 10 years ago, in a position where I could come up with $750,000 really very quickly and buy this building. So I want you to think about this building. By buying this building 10 years ago and paying 750,000, and now it's being worth 2.25 million. It's really grown my net worth, right? It's grown. If you think of it in terms of a golden army, it's really grown this golden army quite a bit over the last 10 years. But at the same time, it's been throwing off an income for me. So one of the reasons I wanted to tell this story was to illustrate what I talk about having a golden army, why I don't talk about it in terms of just savings, because savings is something that you have sitting in the bank, not doing much. But when you think about it as a golden army, you think about putting the army to work for you, and the army can grow itself. I wasn't putting any more money into that building. The building was just growing in value over time. And as time went on, the lease amount, the rent that I was getting also grew over time. So those are ways that the golden army has helped to enrich me without me really doing anything, not putting any more money into the golden army. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
So absolutely.
Go ahead, Karen.
I guess so. I mean, that's an amazing and incredible story. I'm just like, so bringing it back to the artist game, right? I'm like, owning a building. That is kind of mind-boggling, first of all. And then, as you were telling the story, I was thinking, well, I own the building I live. I mean, well, not yet. I'm working on owning the building I live in. And so is that even something, so that as opposed to renting?
That's a great question. So
owning then a good idea?
I'm a big advocate of owning your own home, whether it's a condo or a house. I think it's a really, really big deal. Mm-hmm. And the main reason is because by the time you get to the age where you want to retire, the goal should be to have the house or condo paid off, mm-hmm. where you can live there and move when you want to move, mm-hmm. as opposed to being forced to move because you can't afford the mortgage anymore because you're retired and you don't have an income anymore from your work, right? And hopefully the other lesson that I'm trying to teach here is, as you grow your golden army, you'll have an income coming in from that golden army without having to spend down the golden army. That's the other thing about this real estate. I chose it because it's a very simple example of how the money that I invested in that building is paying money to me on an ongoing basis, right? Monthly, yearly, I'm taking money out of that thing. And it's my golden money, it's my golden army providing me an income. Mm-hmm. And so we can do this in the stock market too. And I think on another episode, we'll talk about how that works. And on a previous episode, I mentioned that all studies show that stock appreciation is much greater than real estate. And I am a really big fan of stock investing. But back to your question, Karen, which is a great question, I'm a very, very big advocate for people to own their own home for the reason that I said, so that you can pay it off and live there. Of course, the other reason is because some of my friends have really big homes, and after their kids are gone, they don't need the size of the home. Right. But that can be another sort of source of a golden army, right? Right. The difference, though, between a house and a building or an apartment building or something like that is a house doesn't give you income unless you're literally renting it out. You're either renting rooms out, or you're, using it as an Airbnb when you go to your second home, mm-hmm. something like that. A house is considered, so I'm going to be talking from a wealthy person's point of view, okay? Right. People think of houses as expenses, not as assets. So when I talk about an apartment building or a commercial building or stocks, those are assets, meaning they're throwing money off to you and they're growing. A home is an expense. So we all know that when you buy your home, you have a mortgage, you have property taxes, you have insurance, you have repair and upkeep. And on a big home, you have pools to maintain and gardeners to take care of your home. I lived in a home that was like that before in Pasadena. Karen, you were there. I think, Todd, you were there also. And everybody loved that home. It was a huge, showy home, and it was so expensive to live there. It was really kind of unbelievable. And I didn't have much of a mortgage on that house. That's not what made it expensive. It was just the upkeep of that home. It was quite expensive. So homes are an expense. And I think that's a primary lesson that I'd like people to keep in mind. It is good that you own your own home, but homes are not considered an asset. They're considered an expense. Make sense?
It
Definitely. So if I could, I have a question.
Sure, of course,
more about your tenant. In that, so this tenant is paying $20,000 a month in this case, or at least was at some point. And obviously, I don't need to know the specifics, but has that person been the same tenant you had from the time you purchased the building?
No, I've had a few tenants. And this does bring up a different example. So commercial lease, this is getting into the weeds a little bit. Commercial leases are generally 5 years. Right? So every 5 years I've had a different tenant, but this tenant that I have right now has been a tenant more than 5 years.
Gotcha.
And the other point that I wanted to make, and this is where I thought you were going, but let me go there. During COVID, a lot of people stopped paying rent.
Yeah.
And I've been very, very fortunate that my tenant has never missed a payment and has always been on time. And I'm just assuming that their business has been able to do okay during the COVID time. But there are a lot of, so I have a very good friend who, and this brings up another point though, that I know what I'm saying, the numbers may be really big. And I think Karen, you kind of reacted to that a little bit, but I want you to know that everything's relative, that I have friends who are pretty wealthy and they look at me with my little building and they think that's so cute. You have a little building that kicks off $240,000. Isn't that cute for you? Because one of my friends, for example, just recently got Amazon as a tenant, and the Amazon is going to tear down the existing building and build from scratch this building. And they have signed a very long-term lease. And that's a tenant that you want to have, Amazon. So I'm just trying to make the point that where I am, some people may say, wow, you're doing really well. Everything is relative. There are people that are doing a lot better than me, and there are people that are doing less well than I am. And so the question about paying rents during COVID is a really tough one. My friends who have apartment buildings and other commercial buildings, especially retail, they've been hit hard. And that means that when you buy a building, you need to be very careful about the debt that you have buying the building, right? I told you that I pay cash for my building. After the deal closed, the bank turned around and said, we'd like to finance your building if you'd like to. And I said, no, thanks. I'm good keeping the building without any debt. And I've had it without any debt all along. I could have made a loan and taken that money and put it into another building or bought bought some stocks or something like that. But I'm pretty conservative with my money, and that was the decision that I made. So even if my tenant stopped paying, I would be in really good shape. I wouldn't be in trouble. And most of my friends are in the same situation. They've been very conservative with loans and not been on buying sprees where they're using a lot of debt.
To do so. And I think where I was also going with that question was, if I'm paying that kind of money, why wouldn't a tenant buy their own building, assuming that they could find a mortgage at $20,000 a month or less? Is it the long-term commitment? Is it because you need that down payment that they just might not have? Like, I guess it's just that reasoning of, when I've looked at some spaces, let's say for theater space, and when I was looking at, and the lease rate was like $25,000 a month, and I thought immediately, I was like, well, first of all, how many tickets do I have to sell just to crack that nut, let alone all the other expenses that go into producing a show? And based upon the capacity and everything that went with it, I thought, I'm just going to set myself up for failure in that particular case with that number. And even if I purchased the building and was able to purchase it, the thought of knowing that the mortgage would be that, I would also be very scared. Now, obviously, when you're an artist and you're selling tickets, it's a lot different than I'm manufacturing an item or something like that. That you have advance orders, and I know I'm not saying it's a sure bet or it's a sure thing just because you manufacture a product versus selling an artistic product, but that sense of security wasn't there for me. But I'm wondering with the building that you had, and I was more just thinking, if you've had a tenant for that long, why wouldn't they have just maybe made you an offer? And if they
No,
had,
I think though that it's a great question, but I think you answered your own question. It's a decision that every business makes. Why would Amazon be signing a long-term lease with my friend and tearing down a building and building a brand new building from scratch? This is all Amazon's cost, right? But they're not buying the land for my friend.
Right.
They've leased the land. It's a business decision. And every business makes its own decisions about whether they want to tie that much money up into real estate versus just being a tenant and paying rent and
And
being
using
able to,
furniture.
right. And after 5 years after your lease is up, you have the option of picking up your stakes and moving somewhere else. As opposed to if you own a building, you're more or less stuck there. That's not exactly true, but the costs are more expensive. The costs are much higher if you own versus being a tenant. And so I think you answered your own question, Todd. There are a lot of considerations, and every business makes its own decision.
Right.
So back to investing. So, this same example that I gave about a commercial building, the same thing goes for a small apartment building. Someone might buy a small six unit apartment building or something like that. The same thing. It's the same sort of principles that in order to be able to do that, you have to have some size of a golden army to begin with, to put money down on the building. You don't have to necessarily do what I did and buy the whole thing in cash. The reason I did that was because I really got a good deal. As I said, the building was appraised at the time to be about $1 million value, and they were looking for 800,000, and I ended up buying it for 750,000. That's a 25% markup on the building during a time when the economy was doing strong. People would have bought the building. I just happened to be in the right place at the right time and be able to pull it off. Within 7 days, I bought and closed the building, and I just happened to be there. So it worked out for me. A lot of people, because there was a tenant in the building at the time, a lot of people are not looking for that kind of investment. A lot of businesses might want to buy a building, but they want an empty building, and then they don't want to have to kick out a tenant and then clean up the building and make changes to the building to make it the way that they want to. So it just worked out for me. But those same types of things happen in the stock market and other real estate, like multifamily apartment buildings, as I was saying. Those opportunities come up every once in a while. An example in the stock market. We'll dedicate another episode to stocks because it's a really big picture. There's a lot to talk about. But the same thing happens to stocks. There are opportunities to buy. And the most recent example that I can think of was last year in March of 2020, when COVID was really first starting to go global and people started saying, this isn't going to be a small thing, this is going to be a big thing. The global stock market sold off, and US stock markets like the S&P 500 sold off more than 30% in a matter of a couple of weeks or a few weeks. And that was a great opportunity if you had army members ready to go to work for you to buy some stocks, some really high quality companies, high quality stocks at a really bargain price. So my point is, these opportunities come up in real estate, they come up in stocks, and you have to have a golden army in order to take advantage of it. So again, I want to say that I started with nothing, right? So don't be discouraged. You have to start small and build. And I also want to say, this friend of mine that I mentioned who has Amazon as their new tenant, he started with nothing. And I can tell you that his net worth is $500 million today. It's really an amazing story. He's done so well, and he has started with nothing. And I'm very fortunate that I've been friends with him for decades now.
That's amazing.
That is amazing.
Wow.
I mean, one thing that strikes me about this, I'll be honest, is,
Please.
I mean, you like this and you're interested in it and you're savvy at it. And I'm like, I'm thinking about buying a building, and I'm like looking at my cute purse that I got, that I saved up for, my very cool vintage purse that I love so much, right?
Yeah.
And I mean, we're joking, but in all honesty,
Mm,
I realize, like, I feel a little fear, and I feel
mm.
a little dumb, and
Overwhelmed.
like
Yeah.
buying a build, you know,
Yeah. Yeah.
I go
So
I go to buildings to sing in and to be there.
So let
That's
me
what I
say,
do
Karen,
for
thank
me.
thank you for that question. I think that question goes right to the heart of this episode's main point, which is you have to start broadening your thinking and becoming aware. If you're going to take care of yourself in your retirement, you need to do something besides having income coming in and income going out. You need to start saving, and then you need to start putting that army to work to grow, whether it's in stocks in small amounts, or whether you get to the point where you can buy a second home to lease out, or maybe you move to the second home and you lease out the house that you're in.
That's
Those are the
awesome.
kinds of things that you do when you start building a golden army. And I think that's the lesson that I wanted people, all of our viewers, to take home today, that you need to broaden your focus and focus on building an army. So you said it, you're right. I have always been interested in business, and I've always been focused on building my net worth from the time I was probably 10 years old,
Mm-hmm.
honestly. And so, and I get it that artists are, thinking about singing and acting when they're 10 years old and not thinking about money. So it's just important to know that no one is born with any kind of knowledge like this. All
Yeah.
the knowledge is learned sort of step by step. And that's why we're here doing the Artistry of Money. We're trying to teach people step by step how they can build enough of a golden army so that they can put their kids through college, and that they can retire and still have a really good quality of life without having to work when you're 70. I know some people are 70 years old and they continue to work, and
Right.
hopefully they love their job. But I know that a lot of people, when they're in their 70s, are tired, and they're tired of working, and they're literally, their bones and muscles ache, and it's hard to get up out of bed, and they would love to not be able to work. And so by learning some of these money lessons, I'm hoping that people will become aware and start
Mm.
making better decisions. Your purse is a wonderful lesson, because I know you love your purse, Karen Marie, but that purse was bought with some of your soldiers.
For
That
sure.
if you hadn't bought the purse, you could have bought some stock, and that the soldiers could have been starting to grow, right? And your
Mhm.
future. And I know that you and your husband have saved, and I know you're doing good, and I know you own stocks, and I know you're doing great. But I'm just saying the
I don't know
point.
about
When you
great.
every time you buy a car,
Mm-hmm.
or every time you buy a new wardrobe, you're
Mm-hmm.
spending your soldiers, you're spending your golden army soldiers.
Right.
And those are soldiers that, 20, 30 years from now can really be doing you some good, enable you to buy a building, an apartment building, or stocks. And I'm going to talk about this again, how stocks can generate income for you the way that real estate can. But
Yeah.
but I think that was a really key question. Thank you for asking. Did I answer your question enough?
Yes. Yes.
So, JR, before we go, because I know we're close to the end of our time,
Right.
just would you say maybe a way to dip your toe into that? Maybe you could explain briefly. I keep hearing advertisements for these REITs or real estate investment trusts, and some of them are called,
Mm.
myuncle.com or whatever, and you have to qualify with this and that. I think it's My Rich Uncle. And by the way,
Yeah.
I'm not promoting them or advertising for them at all. That's just one that used to be advertising a lot. I don't hear it as much anymore, but I do hear about that type of situation. And is that would you say it's a mix of a kind of a stock and a real estate investment? Like, how would you define that? And do you think that maybe if you can't buy the building now, would you take some of that money that you were maybe going to put into the market and put it into something like that, just to be diverse a little bit? Or
So
any overview of that, I
I think there
guess?
were a couple questions there, and let me answer the latter question first, because it's easier. No, I would not do anything differently from what I did. the money that I did in this building, remember, I got a deal, right?
Right.
So that would be the same as, you know, a REIT being sold for 25% below its book value. Book value meaning the value of the assets that it owns, right? So REITs are a special class of stock, and they have different rules that apply to them than the rules that apply to regular companies. One of the main rules is that all of the income that they take in, they pay their expenses, including management fees and all that stuff. All of that has to be paid out to stockholders, to shareholders. So it's a little bit different. You're kind of hiring somebody else to manage the building. But REITs are also divided into specialty groups. For example, there are REITs that have to do with owning malls. I think some of us know some of these very large chains of malls, and they have REITs. You can actually buy these. I don't want to name any of them right now, but you can actually own these malls.
Wow.
And if you had owned these malls or a piece of these malls, I think you would have had a very, very tough time over the last few years, even before COVID.
Yeah.
Yes.
Amazon was changing, and other, online efforts were really changing shopping habits.
Yeah,
And people were
for
going
sure.
out to the mall less, right? So as a mall owner, that was all bad news for you. And then when COVID hit and everybody stayed home and everybody started shopping 100% online, that really changed. It just accelerated that process.
Yeah.
So REITs are something that requires a specialty knowledge if you want to make a decision about buying a REIT. And I hope that answers your question.
Yep, definitely.
So it's like a stock. It trades like a stock. You can buy it like a stock, but it is really different. Instead of owning a business, like when I buy a share of Apple, I'm owning a share of the company.
Right.
When you buy a REIT, when you buy a share of Simon Properties, you're actually owning a piece of all of the malls that Simon Properties owns.
Right.
And you're getting the leases all the rents that they pay. And you're also, suffering through the rents that tenants aren't paying.
Right.
I want to thank you both for joining us again today. I hope it was a useful episode for everybody and instructional. I hope I didn't scare anybody too much. Karen, I'm a little worried that you were scared about this. But if you like this, I would really ask you to please hit the like button and consider subscribing to our channel. And if you think you know somebody who might benefit from the content that we're putting out on this channel, please feel free to share this video with your friends on other social media platforms. And with that, I want to say thank you for joining us. And I want to thank Karen and Todd for joining me.
Thank
And
you.
we'll see you on the next episode. Thank you all.